Welcome everyone to another episode of Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro podcast. I'll be your host today, Chris Minnerly. Today we have a special guest with us. This is Toby Pasman. Let me tell you a little bit about Toby here. Toby Pasman is a neurophysiology researcher graduating from University of Oregon with a bachelor's degree in psychology. During his time there, he worked in the Emotions and Neuroplasticity Project with the Brain Development Lab. There he learned EEG acquisition and artifacting. He then went on to work in the clinical mental health field utilizing EEG as well as quantitative EEG modalities, which included transcranial stimulation, pulsed electromagnetic field stimulation, and neurofeedback technology as well. Later he got board certified in neurofeedback. He's currently working on a master's degree in psychology at Lynn University, and of course he is the founder of Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro podcast. He can also be found, his show can be found here on the YouTube channel Roscoe's Wetsuit, along with audio versions of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so on. All right. So Toby, welcome. This is a special episode for us. Obviously, this is going to be our 100th episode of the podcast that you've created. And so it's a little different today. I will be, of course, the host, and you will be the guest.
Indeed.
So welcome.
How the roles reverse. It's a great introduction that you gave me, one that I'm usually doing for other people, so glad to be introduced.
I appreciate you asking me to do this. It's an honor.
Of course. I'm glad that we're able to do this because, as I was telling you before we started recording, as you already know, you were the first person when I came up with the idea that I wanted to do a neuroscience podcast. At the time, we were coworkers, and I stepped into your office, was like, kind of want to do this podcast where I talk to researchers and neuroscientists and clinicians and ask all of these cool people questions that I just genuinely want to know the answer to have a good excuse to talk to people who otherwise I might not get a chance to talk to. So,
well, it's kind of funny because I know when you first shot the idea to me, I was kind of like, a podcast, another podcast, right? It's like, how many people are making podcasts these days? So it's like, another podcast, and now you're like, who's this kid, right? You know, coming out here trying to ask all these big questions, you know, to these really interesting people, no doubt, but I kind of doubted it, and, you know, here we are 100 episodes later, so it's like, wow.
Haters gonna hate.
You know, foot in my mouth, basically, right? So of course, you know, this is a special episode for us. You know, we're in person today, which is a little different. Got the nice little fire here to keep us warm as well. The first thing I wanted to ask you, I'm sure a lot of people have wondered this as they see your podcast, they watch your shows, they listen. What's the name about? Like,
yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Roscoe's Wetsuit, basically the reference comes from one of my favorite, well, first it started as an album, the album Because of the Internet by Childish Gambino, a rapper. He produced, along with the album, he came up with a screenplay. And in the screenplay there's this theme, this concept of Roscoe's Wetsuit, that these words that continuously appear throughout the screenplay. They may appear graffitied under a bridge, they may be scribbled on a napkin. And no one really knows what it means, it's just Roscoe's Wetsuit. So at the end of the show, or at the end of the screenplay, the boy, the main character, basically comes across a kid who's scribbling down Roscoe's wetsuit. So he thinks, oh my gosh, I'm finally going to be able to get the answer to this mystery as far as what is Roscoe's wetsuit. So he approaches the kid and demands an answer. Well, what is this? What is Roscoe's wetsuit? And the kid's response, I don't know. I just saw it online. So, in a way, the title means some different things. In a way, the title is kind of ironic in the sense that I'm hoping to be delivering material, bringing material to online, to the media that is original, kind of playing off of that ironic name in which people just tend to kind of follow whatever's currently popular, whatever's trending, you know, and lack a lot of originality in my opinion. So with this podcast, as you were saying, because there's plenty of podcasts, there's not necessarily a need for another, you know, just boring podcast. So I figured, you know what, I'm gonna do this different. I wanna have super just raw, interesting conversations, something like this in a way where it's actually just two people having a conversation they may have over lunch, but, you know, be recording it. And it's made for a lot of really interesting and enjoyable content, so.
Excellent. So it makes you wonder, you know, you look at these other podcasts, you know, I mean, obviously there's some really famous ones we could name off that are sort of across the board, right? You know, you might have a guest that, you know, works in a zoo or for, you know, something like that. And then, you know, the next podcast, it's like you're interviewing a criminal investigator. And it's like there's no connection, right? So what makes yours a little bit different and why?
Right. It's a good question. So, you know, I do like to mix up the episodes as far as the general kind of theme, bringing everything back together being basically people who are on the applied end of neuroscience or psychology. Maybe they're not even on the applied end. Maybe they're researchers. Maybe these are people who've dedicated their whole lives to studying some specific part of the brain or some specific neurotechnology, which we might talk about later, and how it affects the brain. And some of these people are not used to being on podcasts. These are not your, you know, media, TV guests per se. You know, some of them are researchers. So, you know, where I feel like I can kind of come in and contribute is basically being on the translational side, basically helping to explain and helping guide researchers to explain their incredibly cool, often complicated research to, you know, kind of a lay audience, an intelligent lay audience who is going to actually benefit and find this stuff really interesting. So that's where I see myself coming in. I view myself as sort of a conduit for, you know, helping all of these incredible, amazing individuals kind of share their message.
So I guess the idea is if you can get someone who, you know, they might be this doctorate who's been studying this pathway in the brain, you know, 20 plus years. It's a very complicated, you know, system, obviously. Taking that person and trying to ask them these questions that they may not usually get, right? Because perhaps they're used to talking to other like-minded individuals, right? Who are able to sort of talk the talk, right? And then I guess the idea is what? To take that conversation and say, okay, well, what does it mean for me? You know, the guy on the street here, you know, or, you know, how does that translate to everyday life?
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff going on in academia that a lot of people don't know about. And a lot of those people are not, you know, they publish books that are designed, as you're kind of saying, for their peers. They publish medical textbooks and you know, research papers in journals. Research articles in journals that, you know, may not necessarily be, you know, they may not be rating books or doing blog posts or podcasts that are explaining their work for lay people, despite the fact that their work has tremendous implications. So I saw a lot of that going on, and I saw, you know, partially before I even came up with the idea to do a podcast, I would just read a research paper per se and be genuinely interested and want to learn more, and who best to find out more, but, you know, the actual author. So the podcast kind of became, you know, this, you know, where it was a good excuse to start having these conversations with people and ask questions that I was genuinely interested in. I don't necessarily view myself as, you know, a journalist who is necessarily objective. I often, you know, will interject my own opinions and kind of give my, you know, take on some of these different concepts and issues and how I see it sort of, you know, applying to just the general public.
So that makes me wonder, like, of all people, why you? You know, why did you think I should be the one to do this?
Right. You know, I'd say probably in college, I realized I really enjoyed doing opinion articles, opinion pieces for the newspaper. And I would always focus, I had pretty free reign to do those opinion columns on whatever sort of subjects I wanted. So I would usually write about things that I were interested in, oftentimes with science, health, the brain in particular. And I found that I have kind of a more natural ability to sort of translate some of these concepts. I don't have 30 years of research experience in one specific thing. I'm not, when I'm doing this podcast, I am not, presenting myself as the expert. I'm bringing in, people who are much wiser and older and have much more experience than me, but I have sufficient knowledge to be able to have these educated conversations and hold my own and really help translate the research. So, I don't know if it's a skill that, I've necessarily developed or something that's just come naturally to me, but I always thought that, that was something that, I could see myself doing.
Okay. And so, that leads me to wonder, if you're the one doing that, do you feel like it's sort of teaching you something new? Like, I know often for me, I read something, I might read it 10 times, and it's like, it teaches me something, right? It doesn't matter what it may be. And then I go and then I talk to somebody about it. And then just bouncing that idea off of them, it almost sort of changes the way I look at it, further instilling it in my brain. Of course, we could talk about the memory system and all that jazz, but to me, it becomes a different concept. And so, do you feel that way, like for yourself, like talking to some of these people?
Certainly, yeah, and I definitely view this as part of my education. I mean, because I'm, oftentimes learning a lot from these guests. Some of them I've read, maybe their research papers or their books, and sometimes it's a time for me to further flush out, make sure that I actually understand the concepts or ideas that are being presented, and also think about them in new ways, and often go deeper in certain areas that I feel like are particularly interesting. I mean, as you know, with research, you could have a long, research paper, a long piece, and maybe there's a few key things that you notice in there, right? And you feel like this is kind of the meat, right? Where as far as someone Joe Schmo may not go and read that 30-page research paper and be able to pick out what are those important pieces. So the way I view my job is, okay, find those important pieces, find the interesting, the best parts of these people's content, whatever it may be, the blogs, the books, podcasts, whatever it may be, and really focus on that and help basically give these people a platform to share their ideas completely openly and honestly. It's always been important for me to try to set the podcast up to have this sort of interaction like we're having right now, where it's genuine, organic. Obviously me and you are friends and we already know each other, so it's a little bit easier because we already have that rapport going. But one of my big jobs is kind of trying to quickly build rapport with these guests who oftentimes I may have never previously met. I may have maybe meeting them a few minutes before we start recording. So that's one of the big challenges I face in doing the podcast.
Right. And actually that leads to another question in a moment I wanted to ask you. But before we get to that, I was curious, okay, so we're having these conversations over this platform, which is obviously pretty new, right? And I know some of your guests in the past you interviewed talked about how new podcasting really is. I mean, maybe 10 years, 15 years at most. Do you feel, just sort of, question to you personally, do you feel like this is the new medium of learning? Obviously, historically, right, it may have been sort of your elder is sort of just giving you the spoken word. This is knowledge. And then it slowly developed to, now we're reading. This is knowledge, right? But and then, of course, obviously, you had paradigms like, the radio, talk radio, certainly. But do you think podcasting is now the new sort of information wave, if you will?
I would argue yes. I mean, in terms of the busy world that we all, live in, oftentimes people don't, have the actual time after coming home from a long work day and having to, take care of their kids and families. They may not have time to read, a 600-page, big bulky book. What they do have time to do, maybe it's on their commutes, maybe it's while they're doing laundry, they can throw some earbuds in, listen in the car, whatever it may be. Podcasting, I think provides a very effective medium to learn, for people who are very busy, who are on the go. So yes, I think podcasting definitely is playing a very significant part in kind of modern day, media journalism, if you will. I think that's something we, can directly see with, take a guy like Joe Rogan, who was definitely an inspiration as far as his method of podcasting, because the way, his show always felt to me was that, it was two people sitting down next, across from each other. They very well could have been at lunch, just with cameras off. He never actually looks directly at the camera. You don't, it's not a, he's not a CNN reporter. He's just kind of your kind of average, kind of interested layman, if you will. But he's asking all of these questions that he's just genuinely interested in knowing the answer to. So I definitely took a lot of inspiration from that. But Joe Rogan is a guy that, is not a classic kind of media figure, yet, I mean, his podcasts have so many millions of downloads. I mean, I don't know about you, but I have a lot of friends who, that's almost their number one source of media is, whatever's on the next 3-hour Joe Rogan.
Yeah, and it leads me to think about this whole notion now. Obviously, you see it on the news, right? People always talking about misinformation. And I think, especially now, everything's becoming so politicized. Not to say that I want to get so deep into that necessarily, but a lot of people might look at, a news network, or they might look at a newspaper, for example, and right away they're thinking, I don't believe that, right? How do you feel that plays a role with podcasting? Because obviously it's a different medium, right? Do you feel like there is that misinformation bias? Like in the sense of, maybe a news network has an agenda, right? Whereas you're just, some other person who's genuinely interested in such a topic,
Right. I think podcast to podcast, it probably varies a lot. There's certainly podcasts that are done by companies, who are talking about the products that they're selling. So in those cases, it might not be this kind of, I don't know if anything really is completely unbiased, because there's always, the host of the podcast with their own opinions, however much they interject those opinions, that varies show to show. But yeah, I think what I've tried to do is to basically just share my genuine opinions on subjects. I'm currently not, selling any products, so there's really no tie that I have to give any, specific answer or recommend any specific thing. I come at it just from I try to just come at it from the perspective of the curious, person who wants to learn more, and that's the same, sort of mindset that I've tried to take, in my academic career, just, keeping an open mind, and it's easy to do so when the people that you're talking to are genuinely intriguing to you.
Absolutely. And of course, speaking of the people, right, this is the special 100th episode, woo! So that's, 99 episodes now that you've done. So what do you think so far? What would you say are some highlights that you've gotten out of this adventure?
Yeah. First things that come to mind, interviewing people, kind of some of the big name figures in our kind of field of neuroscience, obviously speaking to, Dr. Nicholas Dobris, the CEO of Neurofield. Having him on the show was an awesome accomplishment. I really enjoyed talking to a gentleman, Dr. Shad Helmstetter, who's written numerous books, numerous best-selling books in applied neuroscience and motivation. has given talks and been on ABC, NBC, all the major news platforms, and having a guy like him on the show has been an awesome, has made for an awesome episode. There's also been guys, I would say James Fademan, who is a microdosing expert, talks about microdosing psychedelics, has devoted the majority of his career to the research and discussion of that. And he's someone that I actually originally connected with when I wrote an article for the paper several years ago for the student newspaper at the U of O. And we had sort of, built up a little bit of a relationship, and ending up, having him on the podcast is another just, someone that I had, even before I wrote this article, it was like someone I had read his books, not because I was preparing for a podcast. It was something that I just wanted to do in my free time, because as I keep going back to it, just genuinely interested me. So those are the things that come to mind as far as, my favorite guests. Obviously, often, doing episodes with, I'll take a guy like Dr. Nizar Taki, who's a good friend of mine. And I love speaking to him and having these kind of back and forth discussions, because he's a guy that, I'll spend hours, in his Miami apartment just having these conversations with no camera recording. And they're super interesting conversations, in my opinion. So getting to just have that, with the camera going with someone that you already have that, sort of sense of rapport built up, I think that can make some of the best content for the viewers or listeners.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, because I know that you mentioned this earlier about how you may not actually know some of these people ahead of time, right? So you've kind of, from what I've seen, I've watched a lot of your episodes, and I've given you some critiques over the course of your time doing it, which I've seen you've taken to heart in a lot of that. What do you feel has helped you? So, you meet somebody new, right? What do you feel has helped you to kind of get them to relax, to really say, hey, look, we're on the same page now, let's just chat?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and that's a super critical part of, I think getting better, kind of as this year has progressed. I've been doing this, for the last year and a half, and definitely over the course of that time, I've gotten better and better at sort of building that rapport very early on, and then just kind of coming at it from asking easy questions, helping people open up. I'm not trying to put anyone on blast or ask them any, necessarily controversial, confrontational questions that's going to make them kind of, I'm not doing this for shock value, so I think my guests respect that. They respect that I have knowledge within the fields of neuroscience and psychology, and I'm not this guy who's just, necessarily asking them, tell me what your book is about. I think that makes for boring content. So I try to do as much background research and really try to get to, that's really what it is if I can, even if I haven't met this person before, if I've watched their lectures or read some of their books, their research papers, it's almost like I do kind of know them in a sense. They may not know me, but very early on, I can introduce certain or reference certain material that they've been associated with, that they've presented, and very early on, they're impressed that, okay, this is a guy who he's done his research. He's not maybe like some of these other podcasts that are just kind of coming in completely empty-handed. But at the same time, I always do try to maintain that sense of that sort of raw, just conversational nature. So, when I started the podcast, I would write out questions. I would write out, specific questions that I knew I wanted to ask my guest, and I would often write them in a specific order of, I want to ask this first, and then, maybe later on in the show I want to ask them this, and then this. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it worked for me, but oftentimes what I would find is that, the conversation would end up going somewhere else, a very interesting place oftentimes, but instead of me being completely present with my guest, I would be in my head trying to think, oh, well, when would be a good time to interject with this question? I still have questions to get answered. When would be best And you know, I decided to just scrap that altogether, and not to say that I don't prepare for the episodes, but my preparation comes with consuming their content beforehand. When it comes to actually just recording, I found that the best episodes, as the year has kind of gone on, you know, my episodes have become more and more present with the guests, really listening to what they have to say. Maybe if I pick up on something that sounds really interesting to me that they mention, you know, I'll ask them, you know, tell me more, explain more about this thing, where that's something that I wasn't previously able to do when I was still caught up with, well, when should I ask this next question? So basically shifting into more of just a genuine kind of conversational approach rather than a journalistic approach, I think is something that, for me, I've found has produced the best content.
It's kind of funny you say that, you know, because it makes me think of conversations we've had, you know, sort of like the notion of the academic sense versus more of like an interpersonal sense, right? Whereas like you can over prepare for this exam and you're expecting a certain question to pop up because you've read it so many times. You know that this pathway in this particular, you know, molecular structure is going to be on this exam. So now you're expecting it and you're waiting for it, and then it's not there. And so you're getting so caught up in your head with it. Whereas, and I don't know, recently we've talked about that notion about sort of just letting it go, right? Letting it go with the flow, right? And allowing more of that social interaction to occur. You know, is that sort of like, you know, where you're going with it
yes.
now?
Yes, and I think it's very apparent, not just to, you know, we've been talking about this in terms of the guest, you know, that's definitely something that they can obviously sense, but also the listeners. They can certainly sense, you know, if this is sort of a scripted interview, and they can often sense when the guests are answering these sort of scripted questions in their own scripted ways. Because oftentimes these guests get the same questions. They get very basic questions that all of the interviewers ask them. When that happens, like from, you know, what we know about the brain, you know, we kind of go into this autopilot mode, and that's not really inspiring and engaging, you know, discussion that's bringing anything new to the table. That's kind of just the regurgitation of, you know, previously thought about material. So to me, that's not really what I'm trying to do with the show. So the more present that I, you know, am, I think it reflects both on the guests along with the listeners. They can sense that genuine interaction, and they can hear when podcast guests that I've had on the show, they say, you know, they take a few seconds to think about a question that I've asked them, and, you know, they'll make a comment, I've never had to think about it in this way. And that's really what I love to hear when I see kind of the wheels spinning, you know, in their head, because I know that then it's bringing fresh new material to the table. It's not something that you could just find on any million other podcasts that they've been on.
So I was curious, you know, as you start to interview all these different types of people, have you noticed any difference between, you know, say a person who may have been in the field for a long time, you know, whatever that may be, you know, whether they're like sort of like a researcher or, you know, maybe a clinician. Have you noticed how there might be a difference in their way of interacting with you? Like in the sense that, you know, I kind of get this notion that if somebody's sort of been around for a long time, they might be maybe a little bit more set in their ways of how they talk to you, right? Like if you say, hey, tell me about your research, they have sort of like that cookie cutter spiel. Whereas maybe if you get somebody who is a little bit newer, they might be a little bit more sort of, you know, off the cuff, you know, winging it a little bit, maybe sort of a little bit more approachable. Have you noticed that at all?
Definitely. And it's something that I also have a role in terms of, you know, when we have those cases, you know, I have guests on the show who have been, you know, on a lot of other podcasts. It's still something that, you know, I work to make my, you know, interactions, you know, try to ask really interesting questions that aren't something that hopefully other podcasters have asked them. Ask questions that, you know, maybe I've personally thought of after reviewing, you know, some of their work. So, you know, it definitely depends. I mean, sometimes I always try to keep it fresh. Interesting new ideas flowing, hopefully. But certainly with people who have not been on a lot of podcasts, who maybe they're sitting on 30 years of research and they haven't really done a lot of media appearances to explain much of it, it's very, they have plenty to share. And my role in that case is to kind of help them kind of share the applicable, really relevant information that, the more lay person, if you will, is going to really be able to understand, oh, well, this is why the research is so interesting and applicable. This is how, it can be, utilized in this specific neurotechnology or this, way of eating per se that can actually benefit me directly.
Right. I mean, as the listener, I certainly appreciate having, a guest who is more willing to have that sort of off-the-cuff approach, talking about their research or even sort of branching out beyond just that sort of initial interaction. Not to say that your guests are like that, but I have noticed that in other podcasts, right? You have a guest on there that might be a little bit more, I guess, in a sense, sort of closed. I'm here to talk about A and B, and that's all I'm going to talk about. I will say that, I've noticed this sort of transition, right? Or perhaps I like to think of maybe like an evolution in your, podcast, and that a lot of the people that you interview have sort of started to branch out more. Like you might bring them on there to talk about a certain topic, but they're willing to have that topic expand beyond.
Right. And that oftentimes, when we have, 45 minutes to an hour to do a full episode, then sometimes I sort of have that in the back of my mind where I'm like, we can spend, a good majority of the podcast, we can spend the first 20 minutes talking about, maybe their main research ideas, but then I have so much curiosity as far as how they view that, carrying over to different disciplines, or, what maybe a researcher might think of, say commercial, neuroscience technologies that they may not be directly affiliated with, but I'm still curious to hear their opinion. So it definitely, it goes back to what I was saying earlier as far as this is not a directly educational podcast. The goal of the podcast is to inspire interesting discussions, to provoke thoughts, and I would say, doing just asking people, Chris, it's oftentimes as simple as just asking the questions that I'm already wondering, questions that other people are probably already wondering when they're listening to the episode. I think that makes for the best discussions when it's just questions that, if I find them interesting, I think oftentimes other people will find them interesting too. So yeah, I think it depends obviously again on the guest, how willing they are to explore these different areas that may sort of differ from their main research focus. But I have found a lot of guests do very much enjoy having those discussions.
We were talking a little bit about how researchers might get looked at, in the sense of when I watch a podcast or I listen to a podcast, I'm curious as to the level of openness that the researchers might be, or the guests, I should say, might be, in terms of what they're willing to talk about. I would imagine a lot of listeners don't really latch on to the guests that are sort of stuck in a certain mold, right? I know I personally like when a question might be presented that might start off in one realm and sort of branch out into other realms.
Right. That's the big thing when I record a podcast is, and this is something that I didn't necessarily originally start with, but as I've kind of gotten more experience doing these interviews, I made sure to try to make it fit kind of a cohesive, have a cohesive model or structure, if you will, to the conversation. So figuring out ways, that it can deviate maybe from some of the main points and ask, some interesting questions that might lead us down some rabbit hole, which I'm totally fine with. But what's important to me is, making it structured enough where it can eventually kind of direct back to the main focus, or at least explain where that rabbit hole went, and how that actually relates to, the main focus of research or thing that we're talking about.
Well, it's interesting because I find that, especially the more we look at this neuroscience research, we see that things aren't so specific, right? We're starting to notice that all these different pieces are actually pieces of this bigger puzzle that are starting to be presented. And I noticed, of course, we had this sort of notion of, okay, yeah, we might have a researcher come in and he's talking about a certain pathway in the brain, or a certain circuit of the brain, or a certain molecule that interacts in the brain. Then you might have a guest on your show that, might be some sort of yoga instructor who is, sort of in this mindfulness realm of things. Or you might even have somebody who's like a nutritionist, right? So what would you say the role is with that? I mean, if this is a podcast that is neuroscience heavy, how do these other factors actually play?
Right. So my podcast, I would, categorize it as applied neuroscience or applied psychology. And the applied part is basically helping, or basically, I'm only really focused on what's going to be able to make a tangible difference in the listeners' lives. Whether that tangible difference is something right now, or it's coming in the near future. I'm not interested in discussing theoretical ideas necessarily of what might come in 30 years. I'm looking at what the science is right now and how that might benefit people, or at least interest people currently. So I would say that it's people might come at the same sort of topic from a different sort of paradigm. Someone might be describing the neuroscience of mindfulness, in which brain areas get activated or deactivated when someone practices mindful meditation for a given amount of time. But we might also have someone on the kind of more the directly applied approach, who's actually doing, conducting these mindfulness sessions or leading, as you mentioned, kind of yoga classes, and can describe the sort of, benefits as far as awareness and mindfulness and, an ability to stay in the present moment that neuroscientists also try to describe, that they do describe, but just it's from a different lens. So I think those different lenses are really helpful, because one might appeal to one person more so than the other. There could be two different podcasts, and one person might relate and be more intrigued by the sort of neuroscientific approach and might be familiar with some of these brain areas that may be talked about. Someone else who's just interested in kind of the wellness, sort of, brain wellness, who might not actually be, a researcher or someone who's educated in the field of neuroscience. They might very well find a podcast with, a meditation teacher or yoga teacher. They might find that the most applicable. They might find that person is sort of speaking their language, if you will. So I think it's very helpful to have kind of a broad array of guests who aren't necessarily just researchers, just clinicians, just neuroscientists, just yoga teachers. It's interesting to have a combination of those. And it makes it more interesting for my job to talk to a variety of different people.
Well, especially now, because we sort of know, or I guess we're starting to get that notion that all these things are connected, right? I always think about historically in the field of neuroscience and sort of where it was. It's so rigid in its thinking, and you could even see that evidence in textbooks and how they were written, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. we're now, obviously becoming less rigid, I think, and we're thinking, okay, well, there's obviously going to be a role to play with these other systems, whether that be psychology, whether that be, sort of, the nutritional content side, right? The mindfulness side, if you will. How is your physical well-being also playing a role with your brain health? And that's why I find it really fascinating, and we always get into sort of the nutrition. I love to talk about that, but the gut-brain axis and how that plays a role, and how we navigate the world, in a daily sense, how we're feeling, right? But where I also am aware is that we're in this society, especially here in this country, we're very westernized in our thinking, and especially when it comes to technology, we really latch onto that. And of course, there's that push now. We talk about like the push that a lot of people are to sort of Eastern practices of meditation and mindfulness and so forth. But I still strongly see that people love that, or maybe love's not the right word, but people latch on to that sort of westernized viewpoint, or lens, if you will. And so that leads into, the notion of how we're changing the brain using technology. And what do you think about that? What do you think about sort of where we're going with that? Because I know, obviously, we are in that field, right, of neurostimulation and modulation and so forth, but where do you see that taking off or heading, in these next few days, next few years?
Yeah. So I think, we've already seen, I would say, within the last several years, maybe the past decade, you could say, kind of this reemergence of, kind of yoga and meditation has kind of come to the mainstream. And that's not to say that these are new practices. They're not. These things are breath work. These are all things that, breathing is something that has been around since we've been around, right? But, people have figured out ways to modulate our breathing and figured out the biological benefits maybe of doing so. So, yeah, these practices, some of them are new, some of them are old. I think, my personal opinion is that, mixing and matching the different approaches and maybe tailoring, one person may find that, they want to just meditate the old-fashioned way, and maybe they get the benefits of meditation. Maybe they really notice, meditation being a very powerful tool, just sitting down and being mindful of their thoughts. They might notice very powerful effects in their lives. Other people, a lot of other people, can't stick to a meditation regimen, in which case, a more modern technology such as neurostimulation, neurofeedback, that might be able to get them to the same place that the goal of meditation might be trying to take them to, but for whatever reason, maybe it's just a lack of willingness to kind of put in all of the energy and effort to actually learn how to meditate. We obviously live in a very hectic, busy world, so sometimes one of those modern technologies I think may be better suited to some people's lifestyles. And who's to say if we can't come up, if we can come up with a modern technology that really is able to deliver some of the benefits, or even expand on the benefits that some of these more ancient practices have been able to deliver. Who's to say that that may not be a better approach for certain people? So I think it all depends. But I think there's a lot of new, interesting modalities. Maybe ones that haven't been utilized for nearly as long, so we might not know all of the different benefits, side effects that we might be able to be aware of with some of these more ancient technologies. But nonetheless, I think it's sort of a situation of whatever floats your boat. However you're able to get your brain in shape, if you will, if you're wanting to get in shape physically, some people might be more into strength training. Some other people might be more into, cardio. They might just want to ride their bike in nature, and who's to say that one is necessarily better than the other? They may be able to get to the end goal of physical wellness, right, through a variety of these different technologies. So that's sort of the same way I view brain health, as something that there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach, and whatever appeals to different people, I think people should follow that.
Absolutely. There's obviously this big emergence. I actually was looking at some apps last night on meditation. You kind of pointed at the idea that some people might be more apt to doing things the quote-unquote old-fashioned way, whereas, even myself, I find, if there's an app for it, like, why not? It makes it a little bit easier, right? Because obviously we live in this sort of society in which, we're very go, right? We don't really have a lot of time to sort of dedicate, 20 minutes, 30 minutes to meditate. Like, I could probably do 5 minutes, 10 minutes. So if there's a way I can optimize it, why not, And the beauty of our field, is that it is still new in a certain sense, in the sense that, like, if I were to go talk to some stranger at the airport, as I get on my flight tomorrow, he might say, hey, what do you do? And I say, well, this is what I do. Well, he may not understand what that is because it's new to him, right? Or he might think, oh, that sounds like some sci-fi sort of thing, I saw in a movie one time, right? But I sort of see it, becoming more commercialized, right? And I know that, we've been blessed to at least try out certain modalities. I know there's a product I got to try out a while back, sort of like a neurofeedback handheld sort of device, which was kind of interesting. It didn't quite hold, the strength of sort of the clinical devices that we may use. And I'm not going to use any names for that product, but I did find it interesting that now there are these sort of products that, the layman can go on Amazon or some sort of website and buy and start to try these things out. And I think that's going to just expand, We're sort of at this stage now, I believe, it's just going to blow up, which is, it can be quite a beautiful thing, as long as, of course, people are following the guidelines that, we have to sort of provide for them.
Yes, yes. Chris, you bring up an interesting point, because, that's the way I see this unfolding, is that I think, and this is how I explain, the work that we do to a lot of people who may not be really familiar with it is, physical wellness, as far as, the prevalence of gyms, yoga clubs, cryotherapy, places, all of these different ways that we know have been proven to enhance physical health, it's become very mainstream. It's become, an integral part of a lot of people's lives to be a part of these different things on a daily basis. And we're actually really the next frontier, I really think, is the brain. As you mentioned, there's a lot of these, clinical devices that only a select few practitioners have their hands on right now.
Notion that, with this advance in technology, the growth of these sort of commercial products, as well as, I believe, the growth of the field itself, getting more practitioners out there, which in tandem with the growth of these sort of commercial products, I believe is going to help educate more people who may actually end up buying one of these products. Because obviously, as we mentioned, like, you don't want this product out there getting people hurt, but if more people are out there learning this trade, learning this skill, learning this knowledge, they're also out there providing it to people. So I think it's going to help guide these commercial products in that sense too. So you can help, say, have a practitioner help you evaluate what product might be the best one for you at home. Because obviously, we're at this current stage, right? It's like, well, you have to pay me, you have to come to my facility to sit there, for an hour at a time, give or take, out of your busy day. That may not be that feasible for a lot of people. So a lot of people might start wanting to get this thing that they can do at home, right? Well, especially now, right? I mean, this whole pandemic is a whole other ball of wax that, makes it a little even more challenging, right? How many facilities had to close their doors temporarily or even permanently because of these changes? So I do foresee, the products, that you might buy as a consumer, it can be good and bad, as we mentioned, but I do foresee it being good overall because, you might start to get more people in the field that can help guide what's going to be good.
Exactly. And, take the example of gym equipment. There's $50,000 machines that are going to be available, for people to use at LA Fitness or their, whatever gym that they use. And that might not be something that is meant for them to buy, unless they're a very wealthy, consumer. So, they might buy a pull-up bar, they might buy exercise balls. So it's not to say that, it should be one or the other. I think, what we're talking about, there's sort of different levels, more commercial products, more clinical products. And I think it depends, on what people are looking for. Obviously, when you take people with, severe mental health cases, substance abuse cases, oftentimes they do need kind of more guided, more, directed approaches, managed under, a clinician who really has a lot of experience with these products.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that, a product that has been, say, FDA approved, that's more, sort of commercial oriented, it might be more, less customizable, more of these preset programs that, maybe in various studies have proven some benefit. But I think we should get away from talking about, one or the other. Why not a combination? Why not? Because as we've talked about, brain health in general, and not just being diet, not just being supplements, not just being, nootropics, not just being neurofeedback or meditation. It's kind of a combination of, whatever people can put together, whatever works for them, for their busy schedules, whatever works best for them individually. So I think it really is up to each person, but I do see the importance, obviously, of the certification programs in providing, kind of these more, kind of rigorous trainings so that, people can have confidence. When people go to, another professional, they go to a doctor, they go to see a lawyer, they expect that these people are going to have board certifications that show, a sense of competency in their respective fields. And I think that as our field of kind of applied neuroscience gets more and more legitimized, as I think is, what's happening, I think that, I think the certification programs are going to be a big part of it because, our brains are so important. I mean, if you're looking for someone to, say, work on your brain, I think it's definitely important to look for people who have a lot of expertise, who have board certifications in these various modalities because, it goes back to how I seek out podcast guests. If I'm looking to learn about a specific subject, say brain photobiomodulation, I've interviewed, Dr. Michael Hamblin from Harvard. He's one of the leading photobiomodulation researchers. So I always seek to find the experts, the top of the line people who know the most about whatever specific subject that I'm wanting to learn about. I think that's a good approach, in my opinion, for people to take, when it comes to the application of these different tools, is find whoever has the most amount of experience, certifications in terms of dealing with these tools, because they are new technologies. Some of them are new technologies, and there hasn't been necessarily rigorous certifications. I mean, they're we're still seeing them develop. We're not necessarily there yet, but I think it's cool the position that we're at because we're seeing it. We're seeing the field of neurotherapy basically become legitimized, become I think eventually into a mainstream thing. And I think with all things, it's not going to be immediate. It's not something that we're going to just, wake up tomorrow and have all the answers figured out. But I think as our understanding of the brain increases, and as these technologies become more and more sophisticated, and as people become more and more well versed in these different technologies as practitioners, I think the results that people are going to see are going to, exponentially become greater.
Right. I'll dial back a moment to say that I do not agree with these commercial products being used for clinical cases. I should certainly clarify that for any listeners, because obviously, if you're suffering from a certain mental disorder, you're not quite well, you shouldn't just go seek a product that you find on the internet and just start using on your brain. I don't agree with that at all. Definitely, of course, find a local provider who is certainly certified and has experience and so forth to help you out. Now, I do, on the other side of that, sort of the peak performance aspect, I do believe that there is some level, with these products that are on the market today, that they are, I would say safe, in the sense that if you're looking for a peak performance change, if you will, then these products are fine. Now, of course, that I do, you'd have to evaluate the products, of course. But, I kind of see it going this way, like we now see this shift, and a big part of this due to the sort of the pandemic, with this sort of telehealth, becoming a bigger market for therapy, for being seen by a physician, what have you. I certainly could see that being translated to the neurotherapy side of things. If you work with, again, even if this is the sense of where having that clinical piece may be okay to get this product, if you're doing sort of like a telehealth sort of deal, where you're working with your neuroclinician through the telehealth system, then you're saying, look, these are my issues, these are the things I got going on. That clinician, using their expertise and their knowledge, can then pick apart which products are going to be the best for you. Because certainly they're all different, right? And as you mentioned, some might be sort of, fixed. It might be a certain modality that is used. So that would be up to the expert to then say, look, I think for you, product X is going to be the best product for you. And of course, with this pandemic going on, we can't really see you in person. But based on my expertise and based on what I know and based on what I've seen in the literature with product X, you would be a good candidate to use that. This is my recommendation. Once a day, 3 times a week. Go from there. And then that could switch, to the next person. Product X doesn't look really good for you, but maybe product Y is a better fit. And only do it maybe once a week, just based on what you got going on. So I kind of see things going in that realm too, taking, of course, the things going on in the world and how we have to adapt our way of doing things, sort of tying into that sort of notion.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, you want someone with the most amount of training and being able to select the products instead of necessarily being on your own to browse the internet and try to find some product that's suitable for you. I think, again, that's something that we see, the carryover with any other sort of technology. I mean, if you need some home improvement thing, if you're looking to build a fence, you might have a basic understanding of what sort of wood and products that you might need, but at the same time, someone you might find at Home Depot might be tremendously helpful as far as being able to tell you, all right, here are the exact things that you need in order to achieve your specific goals. And I think that's what it comes down to with neurotherapy is we all have different, goals that we're wanting to achieve. People as you mentioned, who are more looking for peak performance, are going to have a very different, first of all, they're going to have a different sort of magnitude of problems. They might not be disabled by the different mental health issues that we see, kind of on a clinical level. They may certainly be looking to enhance various aspects of cognition that research has shown, with different products, with different stimulation modalities or neurofeedback protocols, have shown to improve different aspects of cognition. So I think it all comes down to really, as we sort of, we keep kind of belaboring the same point, which is it all depends on where are you looking to take your brain. And I think that's part of, what I'm hoping to do with hoping that the podcast has helped people kind of become aware, first of all, of all of these different technologies, because there's quite a lot. There's quite a lot of different modalities that people can, now be exposed to. So sort of, I think the first part is kind of getting an awareness of what these different modalities are, why one might use them, and then figuring out, what might be best suited for each, individual.
Right. This is a question I've been thinking of actually for quite a while, but sort of bringing it back to the listeners of the podcast. I was curious if you've gotten a lot of feedback. I know. So of course this is our 100th episode. This is the special landmark episode. Kind of rehashing some of what we've gone through. Over the course of the last 99 episodes, the last year and a half for you in this journey. The listeners that you've brought in over this course of time, has there been much feedback from them? Curious if they're saying, hey, look, I've learned a lot from this, or if there's been sort of like a push to like, hey, can you tell me more about this? Because that'd be something interesting to me. Is like, well, of course, I think it's been helpful, right? Even as somebody who's in the field, I think the episodes are really insightful. But of course, this is meant for the layman at the end of the day. So I've been curious, like, where are they at, and how much have you gotten back from them?
Right. I would say a fair amount at this point. I get a fair amount of comments, on say YouTube episodes that I've posted, or, oftentimes people like you, do just comments, on specific, giving feedback on the specific episodes. I think that's something that I'm really hoping maybe, for the next 100 episodes and more, is that I continue to build more of that engagement with my audience to really see, what's hitting home for them, what episodes, they're really attracted to the most, and maybe what, specific guests they maybe feel like, maybe they're like wanting to learn more, from a specific guest who's talking about a specific modality, say, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. If someone's really interested in that modality, I think that's important. I love receiving that feedback, because then it can help me tailor, my future guests and say, okay, there's a real demand. People really want to learn more about this specific thing. So I'd love to learn more about this specific thing. So why not have guests, or why not re-invite, the same guest? Why not do another episode with a guest who I've already had on the podcast, and go in depth or go in different directions? I see the evolution of the podcast being, very much audience driven. I think that's important. I mean, for any sort of podcast, any sort of media, you are building a brand. You are, building kind of your core fan base, and it's important to be able to understand like what interests them, what doesn't, because not every episode is going to be a home run. Not every episode is going to be everything for everyone. So I think it's something that, as the podcast builds, obviously as the listenership grows, the more feedback, the more comments, and the more community I end up building with Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro. And I'm looking forward to being able to, in the future, actually being able to have, more one-on-one conversations with people. As I previously told you, what I hope to do with the podcast eventually, is actually do these sort of, as we're doing right here, these in-person conversations. I'm hoping to be able to, eventually have a studio where I have people, come in and talk directly and have an audience, where potentially you might have like Q&A sessions at the end of the show where I might be able to have my direct sort of conversation with the podcast guest. But I think it's super important to me for the audience to have that engagement. Because at the end of the day, the reason, I'm recording these conversations and not just having them on my own is to, hopefully deliver impactful, meaningful stuff to my audience. And of course, it's critical to get that feedback, and I think will absolutely help shape kind of the direction of the show going forward.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would wonder, where do we see that going? Because it's important that you engage as many people as you can, right? But I think even more so than that, it's important to engage that core audience, right? Whoever that may be, and whatever number that may be, right? Of course, we all might say, yeah, we want 1 million followers, right? But at the same time, that's not realistic. You might get 1,000 followers that are gonna be on every single episode, and that 1,000 followers is gonna be there. But those are the people, in my opinion, that may be the most important, right? So, sort of tying it up, this is gonna be sort of my last few questions here for you. Where do you see that going? And perhaps if you can give us just a little taste of sort of what's on the horizon to help, engage and keep those core, listeners like myself. Always want to hear what's out, coming next. And then, the last thing I want to get from you is, where do you see the next 100 episodes?
Okay, so to address the first part of the question, I see, definitely the importance of, just getting feedback in whatever possible way that is. I think definitely once I start doing, studio recordings and have a live audience that can interact directly with me and the guest, I think that would be, hugely impactful. What you bring up is a great point that, I was actually taught by a gentleman, I'm blanking on his name, but at Libsyn, one of the primary podcast sort of platforms, who was sort of explaining to me that, a podcaster like Joe Rogan, that I initially, I'm not going to say it's my favorite podcast, but his interviewing style, as I mentioned before, just earlier in our conversation tonight, has been really inspiring to me. But at the same time, Joe Rogan is a figure, he's a media figure, or a public figure who, is able to, say, go from interviewing, Lance Armstrong one day to interviewing Neil deGrasse Tyson the next day, having like such a broad scope. And that's actually probably what I started, with the podcast. I called it Roscoe's Wetsuit. I didn't add the neuro component. That's a recent development within the past couple of months, because I think people don't, before I explained, what Roscoe's Wetsuit actually is, a lot of people are probably not knowing what that is. They probably didn't know that it was a neuropsychology oriented podcast, just by the title. So I think that importance of sort of finding that niche, because I think a lot of products or a lot of podcasts maybe try to appeal to everyone. And as we sort of talked about, even though I see this neuromodulation, this neurotherapy field eventually, maybe within the next 10, 20, 30 years becoming very mainstream, like you see something like exercise, but right now it is very much a niche thing. So my role, I don't think, is to try to get everyone to listen. I think it's to find the people who are listening and figure out really, building that core audience and engaging with them to really see what they want to hear, what they want to learn about, what they're hoping, what value they've already gotten from the podcast and how I can deliver more value to them. So that's really my main focus is sort of building that core audience, because I'm not Joe Rogan right now, so I have to focus on the people within the neurotherapy field who are listening, and really target their needs and what they're hoping to see. And then if you could just repeat the last question that you were asking.
So the last thing I was just curious is, we probably didn't see, maybe you did, right? As I mentioned earlier, I didn't see it, but we got to 100 episodes, and that's a great accomplishment. So the last question was just, where's the next 100? Where's that going? Just kind of your thoughts on that, and sort of perhaps what you have on the horizon for us.
Yes. Yeah, so definitely the way I see it going, I see the podcast, I've heard this, it put this way, that a podcast is like a business card. It's not necessarily the end product of a business. It's simply, the introduction, the foot in the door, if you will, to sort of let people know, okay, this is what I'm about, this is what I stand for. But as I've been going forward, I have entrepreneurial aspirations to go into these different, to actually take these different neurotechnologies and actually start working with people on a more peak performance level, eventually kind of building into a center that I have plans to do in Miami. So as I see the podcast sort of becoming almost this sort of business card of sort of like an introduction to people, to potential clients, to help people get an education and awareness of the products and of the technology that they may be using, and don't just take it from me. That's what I think is really important, is listen to all of the experts who are talking about the different technologies that I'm going to start incorporating, into my entrepreneurial ventures. I think that's why the podcast is so important, is because, I could pitch something as a businessman, as a marketer, and I might be able to do a decent job of that, and I might be able to do a convincing job of that. At the same time, though, there's going to be people that are going to say, they're going to be skeptics. They're going to want to see the hard science. They're going to want to know, is this just a gimmick? Is this just a product that's, trying to just sell something? Is this really actually going to do anything for me? And I think that's why trying to get, those researchers who know the legitimacy of the work they're doing, but to actually have them sort of connected to this entrepreneurial sort of these business ventures, and really have them interconnected with, as I go forward. I think that's super important. Just because I the way I view things is that, I'm not going to say I'm necessarily the expert in any specific area of neuroscience or neuromodulation, but what I do see is that, I'm able to integrate and I'm able to bring together all of these experts, kind of into one platform, being Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro, and having kind of, building a community. And hopefully the way I see it going is that, eventually these podcast guests will be able to, it won't be just me interacting with my audience, it'll be the podcast guests interacting with the audience. Building the whole brand of Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro, in the sense that it's a community. It's not just me, It's not just Toby Pasman doing this podcast. It's now all the listeners, all of the guests who've been on. They're all part of the Roscoe's Wetsuit community. And I think with anything, just with any sort of community, just the sort of collaboration, the integration of all of these different pieces, I think helps just grow the community and helps build these connections that I think is really important, because there's as we sort of talked about, and just the theme, I think a big theme of what we've just been talking about is how there are all of these different, there's all of these different modalities, there's all these different practitioners and clinicians and researchers, and oftentimes there's not a lot of cross collaboration. Sometimes there may be. I think it's great when there is, but I see what I can do with Roscoe's Wetsuit is really help bring people together from these different fields and inspire, as the podcast I hope does, inspire discussion. And I think basically the next 100 episodes I see being, less so focused on maybe what I find, what I find interesting, or what people I'm hoping to talk to, but really listening to see what the audience is hoping to get, what they're hoping to achieve, and hopefully really building a real tangible audience. I could see myself doing conferences in the future, as there's certain neuroscience conferences such as Neurofield that goes on, that brings together people of sort of these disparate areas of neuroscience, and they come together and they're able to share ideas. I mean, what is Roscoe's Wetsuit besides really a sharing of ideas? So it's building a community just like any other community, and I think it takes time. Obviously the podcast, when I first started it, just had a handful of people listening, but as the listenership increases, I see, especially once COVID hopefully gets taken care of, I see these in-person events where we get people actually talking to each other face to face and really see where it goes. I don't see it as just being a thing that I'm doing anymore. It's something that I've started, but I hope that people will sort of take Roscoe's Wetsuit and they apply it to their own lives and take it wherever it's going to go.
Well, I mean, that's all we could hope for. Well, I appreciate everything you've done in this last year and a half. This has been quite the journey to see, as a friend and colleague, as an avid listener of the podcast. I think it's been a hell of a journey, and so I congratulate you on your success with it. Happy 100 episodes, and of course, thank you for having me here. And to the listeners, this is of course Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro podcast. It can be found on Apple. Can be found on Spotify, if I recall correctly, as well.
Correct.
And he's also posting on YouTube. I'm sure other podcast channels as well. So thank you guys for allowing me to be here and hearing my spiel. Toby, appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, sir. Yeah. And obviously, as we just talked about, the importance of just that, whatever the audience thinks, I'd love to hear your guys' feedback, not just on this episode, this 100th episode special, but with all the episodes. Please don't hesitate, contact me, leave comments, leave suggestions. I think, something that with Chris specifically is something, Chris, you could have, when we've talked about podcast episodes, you could have simply said, "Oh yeah, great job, man! These podcasts are awesome." But that doesn't help me necessarily get better. What helps me get better and deliver more meaningful, impactful, better content altogether is that constructive criticism. Figuring out, okay, here's maybe little ways to tweak, the wording of certain things I'm saying, or maybe, at the end of episodes doing, sort of a summarization of ideas, some of the summarization of the main points that the guests have pointed out. So I think, I commend you, sir, for that constructive criticism, and I hope to get more of that, from all of the listeners. I think that's, I think that is what helps kind of improve what I'm doing, and as we sort of talked about, I'm only a year and a half into this. There's been people who've been podcasting for a lot longer, and I plan on doing this podcast for a lot longer, but the way I see myself getting better, just as with any tool and any skill, is both the repetition along with that feedback, that constructive feedback from people who really care, who are really dedicated to see the show grow into whatever it may be. And it may not just be a show. I mean, obviously, as we've talked about, I'm hoping to do different entrepreneurial ventures, take this thing, all the way. And I look forward, to meeting all of the listeners, being a part of their journeys, having them be a part of my journey, and we'll see where this thing goes. Who knows?
Sky is the limit. Thank you, guys.